Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our political statistics class. This is our fourth lecture. This is the fourth week. And we're going to talk today about the second part of descriptive statistics. And we're going to gradually move from this week to the next week. We're going to move from a kind of simple presentation to a more complex kind of conceptual level. We're going to learn an introduction to probability theory and to the role of sampling in scientific research in general, but in particular in political statistics. Okay? Something that is important to mention is that we're going to have very soon the first report, and I changed the due date of this report to February 12th, and I'm going to give you instructions to prepare this first report. Keep in mind that February 12th is not this Wednesday, but the next Wednesday. And for that reason, you need to budget your time. You can submit the first report before if you want, even next Sunday. That's fine for me. But you have this extra time. And this is because you need to do several tasks. You need to find a data set that is interesting for you. And you need to think about a relationship of interest. For instance, you want to, I don't know, imagine that you want to explain, I don't know, the relationship between democratic stability and economic development, something like that. So you need to figure out what kind of data sets do you need, what is the best variables to try to study this relationship of interest. And that's what we want to do this first report. You need to think about that. You can write me about the kind of relationship that you have in mind, and I can help you to find or to identify the data set that is more relevant for this kind of question. And actually, I'm going to give you already a list of data sets that I think can be useful for you to conduct this applied project. But don't worry about it. I'm going to give full instructions of that very soon this week. And it's just an announcement that I wanted to give you. Okay. Okay, something that is important to mention as well is that those of you who are not able to submit an assignment, either the lab or the quiz, need to write me on Monday and ask me to give you the opportunity to submit the late assignment during the week. Remember that you only have the opportunity to submit these late assignments twice. So keep in mind that, and it is important that you write me, because otherwise I'm gonna assume that you don't want to submit these late assignments, and I'm gonna move on. Okay? And related with the discussion boards, thank you so much for your participation. I saw that some of you wrote wondering if I would keep giving points to the people who participated in the discussion boards, and yes, the answer is yes. I'm gonna keep doing that. I'm gonna announce you who earned points in the week 2 and then week 3 very soon. And I also gonna prepare a table, like an Excel table with the people who have earned extra points. These extra points are useful for you guys. So those of you who have especially low grades, try to seize every opportunity that you have to earn extra points to increase your grade. Okay, so let's move on to the topics of this week. Let's remember what we learned about what can we do with descriptive statistic methods. So basically, we learned last week the basic concepts of univariate analysis. I thought that we can just bypass those topics, but I realized that it's important that you have these foundations very strong, even if you have already studied the mean, the median, and these kind of things. Probably the standard deviation is not the most common topic in, I don't know, in the high school, I guess. I'm not sure about it. But it's important to keep in mind these ideas of how the measures of central tendency and how the measures of variability are related, and also how they help us to identify and describe and understand the shape of a distribution of a variable, right? So that those are very basic building blocks that you have to have. Like you need to be very sure that you know about them in order to move on in the next contents of the class. And in general, in descriptive statistics, you need to know about them. Okay, so we did that last week. This week, we're going to move to bivariate and multivariate analysis. And remember that what we want to do here is to identify those zero order effects and the partial effects. Okay, I'm going to talk a little much more about it during this lecture. Okay, the final thing that we need to have in mind again, and is that in the conceptual class, I'm going to provide you tools to analyze these relationships, and I'm going to teach you how to use them in the way that we usually use them in political science. And in the technical lecture, I'm going to teach you how to use R to prepare these tools. And by tools, I mean the graphs, the figures, the tables that you're going to use to analyze these relationships. Okay? So for this week, the level of intensity of the technical part is going to be high again. We're going to keep that level very high during this week. We're going to learn how to prepare even more complex objects. We have learned the very basic objects and how to manipulate some of them. Last week we learned how to manipulate variables, which are critical for us. Variable transformation and variable manipulation is a building block in R. But now we're going to move to more complex kind of objects, such as figures, plots, and tables, right? But don't worry, because we're going to try to keep things simple to some extent. And I'm going to split the contents of what I thought would be this class, the technical class, into two parts. I'm going to give you the basics of how to prepare tables and figures. And the next week, we're going to learn a little bit more about how to prepare even more complex tables and even more complex figures. Let's start with the bivariate analysis. Remember that our research question in the bivariate analysis is something like does X have an effect on Y? Does, I don't know, whatever, like democracy has an effect in human rights respect, or I love that kind of topics, I'm sorry, but whatever is the kind of relationship that you are interested. For instance, is there the racial composition of a state has any effect on the election of democratic candidates or something like that? So whatever the kind of relationship that we want to explore in a bivariate kind of analysis, the key thing is that we want to identify what we call zero order effects, or relationships between two variables in which we don't pay attention to the role of confounders or external or control variables or other variables in this relationship. It is important to keep in mind, however, that these kind of relationships, or this kind of analysis better, tend to be weak. Remember that we talked in the lecture about research design, that there are plenty of opportunities to have bias samples, or to have selection bias, or the possibility that other factors are the real causal explanations of our outcome of interest. For this reason, zero order effects are not the best kind of, or this kind of bivariate analysis is really not the best way to do, to conduct a statistical analysis. But you can think about this as a first step, like a first stage in the statistical analysis, in which you just see what is the relationship between these two potential variables. Okay? We have different tools in order to analyze these relationships. One of them is the cross-tabulation. The cross-tabs are very useful when you have two categorical variables, when you have independent and dependent variables that are at the nominal or ordinal levels. And basically what you do is something like you put the range of values or of your independent variable, define the columns of your table, and the rows are defined by the values, the potential values of the dependent variable. And let's explore this toy example. As I said, is there any relationship between democratic voters and gun control policies? For instance, in this case that I'm using Pollock's example from the book. And Pollock gave us some instructions to follow in order to conduct this statistical analysis in an appropriate way. One is that is important is that you need to see or study the percentages. What is the relationship between these percentages rather than the raw values, right? That's very important. And what you do is something very simple. You see what is the change in those values of the dependent variable when you move from one value to another value in the dependent variable. So those who support more control tend to be Democrats, more Democrats than Republicans, as you can see here. And similarly, those who support less control tend to be more Republicans than Democrats. Okay, so the table supports our hypothesis, our toy hypothesis. And in addition to the tables, we can prepare graphs. And one of the most useful graphs with this kind of information are the bar graphs. So the bar graphs, as you can see here, first of all, display a lot of information in a very simple way, and it's very easy to understand the tendencies here. So you can see that more control again goes down when you move from Democrats to Republicans and goes up in the opposite kind of relationship. Okay. When you have a dependent variable that is at least at the ordinal level, but it's better to be in the interval level, at least in the interval level, you can estimate means, and therefore you can use the mean comparison tables. Okay? And in this case, I use again Pollock's example of the relationship between development and human rights respect. And what Pollock does is he explores the Freedom House score that goes from, I think, from 1 to 10 or from 1 to 12, being 12 the highest level and 1 the lowest level. So a country that has a value of 12 means that the government respect the human, like the rights of its citizens, like this, especially political freedoms. Okay. And what you do here is that you group the countries by values of the GDP, and basically you estimate the mean score of the Freedom House for these groups. Okay. And you can just explore going from the low level of GDP to the high level if this expected relationship holds or not. And you can see here that, yeah, when you move from less developed countries or developing countries to developed countries, you can see that the respect for human rights increases. Okay. The third kind of figure related with these mean comparisons is the line chart. The line charts are very useful again. You can use them to see, and very easy you can identify positive relationships, such as in this case of the mean score of Freedom House and GDP, or negative relationships. If, for instance, you were doing the same exercise, this is a toy figure. This is not, doesn't have real information. It's just to, but it's probably what you may encounter if you were estimating the relationship between the political terror scale and the GDP. The political terror scale is the opposite of the Freedom House scores. The political terror scale, if you don't remember, because we talk about that in another lecture, is an ordinal variable that measures the extent to which the regime violates human rights. One is like when the government rarely violates human rights, and 5 is when it does it constantly, frequently, and massively to some extent. And again, you can see the relationship here, the negative relationship between the GDP and the political terror scale. But you can use line charts to find, to some extent, more interesting or sometimes very interesting relationships, such as non-negative relationships. This is what is called the diminishing rate of return. And the example here is between age and social disconnectedness. And here Pollock is using an example of this social disconnectedness. Basically is an index in which a poll, researchers ask individuals the extent to which they have frequent relationships with friends, with relatives, and so on and so forth. And they found that as you get older, your levels of social disconnectedness are higher. Okay? But I think a most basic example, and that I think is more powerful to convey the idea of diminishing rates of return, is the relationship between hours of studying and the performance in an exam. Of course, if you study very few hours, you probably will have a very bad score. But if you study more hours than necessary, your performance probably is not going to go up, and maybe even can go down. Okay? If you, for instance, if you don't sleep the night before the exam, probably you will have not the best kind of a score. Okay. There are another types of relationships called the B or inverted B shape kind of relationships. And these kind of relationships have an interesting history in political science. There is this debate, or there is this area of research called the dissent repression nexus in comparative politics and IR. And there are several theories. One of the theories is that there is a inverted B relationship between dissent and regime type. Some authors, such as Mark Litvak, said that authoritarian and democratic regimes are less likely to experience high levels of dissent. And the reason that he contends in one of the classical pieces of literature in this area of research is that authoritarian regimes have or tend to have high capacity to repress the mobilization of the citizens on the one hand, and on the other hand, the democratic regimes have higher capacity to respond to the demands and social discontent of its citizens. So they experience low levels of dissent, like protests, violent attacks, insurgencies, and these kind of things. But semi-authoritarian regimes don't have the capacity to repress, and they don't have the capacity, or they don't have the levels of responsiveness or of the democratic regimes. Then they tend to experience high levels of dissent, right? Other authors say no. What really happens is that there is a polynomial kind of relationship between dissent and regime coercion. And this is the hypothesis called the backlash effect. And this is the idea that when a regime, either an authoritarian regime or a democratic regime, incurs in extreme levels of coercion, there is a backlash effect, because the citizens will no matter or regardless the risks of the mobilization or the risks to be repressed, they're gonna mobilize anyway to try to change the regime, right? You can see to some extent this idea in across different kind of regimes, even here in the United States, if you try to think about the case of the civil rights movement, for instance, in the South. Okay? So this is just to give you an example of how these tools can be actually relevant for us and interesting for us.